Welcome to week 4, episode 4, a continuation of our lectures on the immune system with a focus on inflammation. In this particular episode, we will highlight the distinction between acute versus chronic inflammation. Up until this point, the lecture series for this week has focused on acute inflammation. In this particular episode, now we will chat about chronic inflammation, which is defined as those inflammatory responses which last longer than 2 weeks. Now, there are several different reasons why this can occur, including an unsuccessful acute inflammatory response, such as you have pus formation or incomplete wound healing. You can have a high lipid and wax content of a microorganism such that it cannot actually be broken down by that phagocytic cell known as the macrophage, and it could actually be able to actually survive inside the macrophage as a result. Toxins can also lead to tissue damage and persistent inflammation as well. These could be chemicals or physical irritants. Chronic inflammation can be characterized by a dense infiltration of lymphocytes and macrophages. The body may actually try to isolate infection to protect against tissue damage by the formation of a granuloma as well. Now, what happens when macrophages cannot protect a host from damage? You can see this flow diagram highlighting that in some cases, macrophages cannot protect a host from tissue damage, and therefore it can result in the macrophages containing cellular debris or the fusion of many macrophages so that they can actually engulf large particles. This ultimately leads to that granuloma formation in which you've isolated an infected cell and surrounded it by lymphocytes and can encapsulate it with a fibrous collagen. Now, collagen is a very strong kind of material, and it is also associated with the formation of cartilage or calcification. Once again, this is really to help isolate and protect the body against tissue damage. Now, what you can see here is with wound healing. Wound healing can occur after tissue damage has resolved. It starts with debridement, which is the cleanup of any sort of dissolved clots, microorganisms, red blood cells, or dead tissue cells. There are two types of healing, both resolution and repair. Resolution is when you are returning an injured tissue to the original structure and function, whereas repair is the replacement of the destroyed tissue with scar tissue. And you can see a hypertrophic scar shown on the top right of your screen. Scar tissue is primarily collagen, and it actually helps to restore strength. As I mentioned in the preceding slide, collagen by nature is a very strong material. It cannot carry out the same physiological functions, though, of that original tissue prior to injury. You can also have dysfunctional wound healing, whereby you have very large amounts of collagen form and such that it's called a hypertrophic scar. Hyper meaning essentially more than what is necessary. Wounds can also be disrupted, leading to increased risks of infection. And there are a number of risk factors associated with how well one is able to resolve and regenerate that original structure and function prior to the injury. Things like diabetes, obesity, poor nutrition, and tobacco smoke all will be associated with more of a dysfunctional wound healing. Now, the last slide of today's episode, the process of healing. You can see that healing is not an overnight process. It does, in fact, take at least a few weeks to occur. And you can see in the graph how the process of inflammation is then replaced by new tissue and or remodeling and maturation of tissue over that 2-week period. This graph also nicely highlights the early and late inflammatory responses. You can see the neutrophils being more of an early inflammatory response, peaking very early in the process, approximately around 2 days, whereas the macrophages actually have a much more prolonged and late inflammatory response, as you can see on the graph. Healing is broken down into the 3 phases as shown on the flow diagram. The inflammatory phase, the proliferation and new tissue formation, whereby new or scar tissue can form, and collagen synthesis can also occur. And then finally, with remodeling and maturation, and that occurs over the longer term. Scar tissue may be remodeled, for example. Finally, I've included this video, which you can watch on your own time, which highlights this process of inflammation and how our body is able to respond to it. So that concludes this lecture episode. Thank you very much for tuning in.